Over this coming term through to the new year, we're kind of loosely basing the evening messages on some of the, well, one of the books that we will be looking at. So at the moment we're in Luke, but soon we'll be taking a break and going into Genesis. And so we're going to be looking at the life of the life of Joseph in Genesis. Close, not quite right, but close. From Genesis 37 through to chapter 50. So we're going to be doing that series over this coming term. I gather that a good few years ago you did pretty much up to this point earlier on in Genesis. So we're going to be completing Genesis now. We've got a chapter before us, great chapter, great story, and Alan and Rachel are going to share the reading of this chapter with us.
Genesis 37. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of corn out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered round mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off to the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing the flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan.
But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes the dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing. And they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat a meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. As his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard.
Thank you very much, both. Thank you. We're going to sing "All the Way My Saviour Leads Me." That's what we've got to cling on to. Surely that's what Joseph had to cling on to with all that was going on for him, as we've just been reading, and in the coming chapters too. So let's sing "All the Way My Saviour Leads Me." It would be great if you could turn back to Genesis chapter 37. We're looking at this chapter under the title of "The Invisible Hand." For the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of the shoe, that's a horseshoe, by the way, the horse was lost. For the want of the horse, the rider was lost. For the want of the rider, the battle was lost. For the want of the battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail. You probably heard that or similar before, just indicating how one little thing, a nail that was not there when needed to sort out a horse's shoe, its horseshoe, could actually lead to the downfall of a kingdom. It is amazing the incredible results which can come from one tiny, apparently insignificant event. Every event has a kind of knock-on effect. We can speculate with the what-ifs that might have happened in our own lives. If something had turned out differently, if we'd done something differently on a particular day, how would that have affected the rest of our lives? You can do it with history. You can do it with the biblical history. I mean, think, for instance, what would history have turned out like if Pharaoh's daughter had not seen the basket at the edge of the Nile where the baby was called Moses? Only by her, he wouldn't have been called Moses even, but if the baby had not been seen in that basket, there would have been no Moses, no burning bush, no exodus of the people, rescuing of the people out of Egypt. There would have been no giving of the law, the Ten Commandments, the prophets, Jesus, the cross, redemption, Christianity, Western civilization as we know it. All of those things follow from that event. But the reality is there are no what ifs with God. No what ifs with God. He is in control. We make a mistake if we think, as some do, and some Christians would even say, we make a mistake if we say God is in control of the big things, but we have freedom in the small. It both doesn't make logical sense, and as we'll show in a minute, it doesn't make biblical sense either. It doesn't make logical sense because you can't separate the small events from the big events. One thing does lead to another. And the reality is the Bible is very clear that everything is controlled by God. So, for instance, in Ephesians 1, verse 11, it tells us that God works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. Everything. And down to this detail in Matthew 10, Jesus says, "Are not two sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care." Every little sparrow. It only dies if God says it's time for it to die. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So even the loss of a hair is known by God and under his control. Now that's a powerful message which comes through from several angles here in Genesis chapter 37. So what I want us to look at first of all is the sovereign rule of God. This is, starting here in Genesis 37, an incredible story. And I use that word carefully. It's history. It's an account of history. It's not fiction type story. It's history type story. These are real events. It's the kind of incredible story that has been dealt with by poets, writers, and musicians down through the centuries, perhaps most famously in recent times by Andrew Lloyd Webber with his Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. The story is gripping. It's got everything in it. There's jealousy, rivalry, sexual temptation, deceit, violence, suspense, twists and turns. But we often forget why it's all happening. It's happening because of the sovereign rule of God, that there is an invisible hand orchestrating all of these events. Each person, as far as they're concerned, and as far as you read the story, is their own thing. They're free to choose. They make their own decisions. They don't come across in the story as machines, with kind of robotic obedience to something else. They're not puppets. We can't see the strings that are controlling them or anything like that. What we read of here in these chapters are self-willed, impetuous, decisive people. And yet when we stand back, what we see is God is in control. He's in control of the whole plan. We know that because 150 years earlier, roughly speaking, God had spoken to Jacob's grandfather. That was Abraham. So that's Joseph's great-grandfather. God had said to Joseph's great-grandfather Abraham these words in Genesis 15 and verse 13. "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and ill-treated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites it has not yet reached its full measure." In those few words, God gives the plan for the next 600 years of history. There's roughly 160 years from when God said that to Joseph going down into Egypt, roughly 10 years before Joseph's family then followed him down into Egypt. They were, just as God had predicted in those verses we've just read, they were there in Egypt for 400 years. They leave at the time of the Exodus. God brings them out. They spend 40 years wandering and they return to Canaan, basically 600 years. God had it all planned. He mapped it all out back then, even the reason for it, that the sin of the Amorites was not yet complete. They were going to go back to the land of Canaan at a time when it was time to judge the Canaanites and then give the land to Abraham's descendants. So Genesis 37, this chapter we have before us, is God setting the wheels in motion for this whole plan spanning, well, those 600 years we've just thought of, but actually right down into many other aspects as well. The whole plan was under his sovereign rule. And yet when you read Genesis 37, you wouldn't have known that. Did you notice who was missing from Genesis 37? God. He's not even mentioned. Well, he's not mentioned explicitly. He's there. He's the invisible hand orchestrating all of this to fit exactly with what was predicted to Abraham 160 years earlier. Now, when you think of Genesis 37 as a piece of writing, Moses was actually writing this at the time of the Exodus, as the Israelites were returning to Canaan, some after 400 years in Egypt, more than 400 years after the events of this particular chapter. Why is he writing it? Why is he telling them? Just to tell them a bit of interesting kind of backstory to who they are and how they ended up in Egypt and all that kind of thing? Well, useful though that is, I think it's more key that Moses wants the people to know this is God's plan. Our return is not just happening. As our journey into Egypt in the first place didn't just happen. God is in control. God is orchestrating all of this. He's the invisible hand behind all these things. Perhaps not so invisible at the time of Moses. God made his hand very clearly seen. But it's good for us to know as well as the Israelites in Moses' day, that the whole plan is in God's sovereign rule. Your life, my life, your family, my family, our church, the nation we live in, the world, 2020 with all of its surprises, disappointments, heartaches, shocks, coronavirus, lockdown, all these things, they are all under God's sovereign rule. He makes no mistakes. And we should make no mistake about understanding this very important point. We also see that he's in control of the details. So he's in control of the big plan, but we also see in the chapter that he's in control of the detail. He must be, because the two belong together. And you see it here in this chapter very clearly. I mean, first of all, we've got this 17-year-old kid, basically, teenager, Joseph. That's pretty much his age. We can be fairly sure of that. And he obediently, obeying his father, that is, he obediently goes on an ill-advised trip to check on his brothers. Ill-advised because his brothers hate him. Ill-advised because they're in the middle of nowhere and he's got to go and find them. But he goes obediently on that. And when he's approaching them, their minds have been affected by the little details of things that we read in the passage. So in verse 2, for instance, we read that Joseph had got them into trouble. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wife, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Nobody likes a snitch, do they? And most likely here, his brother's not happy. This is in the back of their minds, maybe even in the forefront of their minds. He's got them into trouble. And then there's the detail of this coat that he had been given, and the favoritism that it so clearly demonstrated, verses 3 and 4. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. See the animosity that's developing here between them. There's the bad report, there's the favoritism of their father, Jacob, or as he's called there, Israel, two names for the same guy. And there's the ornate robe, which just demonstrates the father's favoritism, and probably the fact that he didn't expect much manual labor from this son because he was his favorite, born in his old age. And then there was the first dream in verses 5 to 8, where he had this dream where he and his brothers were binding sheaves, and then their sheaves bowed down to his sheaf. And then the detail that he doesn't keep that to himself, but he tells his brothers. And what does that do to them? How does that make them feel about him? And then he has the second dream. So there's another little detail. The second dream is of the sun, moon, and there's 11 stars, and they all bow down to Joseph's star. And again, there's the detail that Joseph doesn't keep this to himself, but he goes and he tells his brothers and his father. And you can hear the frustration, the rebuking of his father in verse 10. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? These details all work towards what eventually happens, that the brothers attack of Joseph, they're selling of him as a slave. And then there's the details of the empty pit. Isn't that a lovely verse? Absolutely lovely verse. Where it says that Joseph was thrown into the pit, and at the end of verse 24, the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Oh, it was bad being chucked into a pit, but oh, it was so good that pit, that cistern was empty. He didn't drown in there, spend hours treading water in there. It was okay in there. And then there's the detail of the Ishmaelite traders on their way to Egypt. You know, that they just happen to come at the right time so that he doesn't die in the pit, but he's sold as a slave. And they're going to the land where God wants them to go to. They go to Egypt. You see, you can't separate the detail from the whole plan, and it's all under God's sovereign rule. Let's capture that for ourselves. Secondly, let's look at this. For the sake of the children, it is frightening to see the sins of Jacob's past re-emerge in the life of his family. So, for instance, there's terrible rivalry. We've just seen that here between Joseph and his 11 brothers that reaches frightening proportions, where they actually think they're going to kill him, but only Reuben argues them out of that point to sell him as a slave, and he gets sold as a slave instead. Reuben had secret plans to actually rescue him, but you know, his brothers who would kill Joseph. What incredible rivalry. But hang on, if you can cast your mind back into Genesis, if you know the book already, remember Joseph's father Jacob and Jacob's brother Esau. The incredible rivalry that there was there between those two brothers, particularly on Jacob's part, where he wanted to cheat his brother Esau out of his birthright because Esau was the firstborn. He had that right. And then there's the time later when he marries. Jacob marries, but his father-in-law gives him the wrong woman. So he ends up marrying two sisters, Leah and Rachel. And there's incredible rivalry then between these two. And each one of these two, Leah and Rachel, gave their servants to Jacob because they're having trouble having children at various points. There's incredible rivalry between them. And here it is, being passed down the generations through to Joseph and his 11 brothers. And then you can see the same kind of favoritism going on. We've read verses 3 and 4 where we see that Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than his other sons and gave him this ornate robe. Well, he himself was brought up in an atmosphere of favoritism. Jacob was. In Genesis 25:28, it says Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So Jacob was his mum's favorite, while his brother was his dad's favorite. There's a lot of favoritism going on there, and he continues it down to the next generation. And then there's deceit. I mean, this would in the end be headline news where when Jacob discovers that actually his 11 sons have been deceiving him with this coat, this ornate robe that's been ripped and daubed in blood, and Jacob reaches the natural conclusion, and his 11 sons don't tell him he's got anything wrong. He concludes that Joseph has been killed. Well, they're deceiving him. But so it had been with Jacob, how he had deceived his father out of the birthright which his father had planned to give to Esau. See, these things are more than coincidence. What is God's point in his word here, linking these things for us? Why is Moses writing of them? Well, there's a message here to us to say, look, for the sake of the children, we must deal seriously. We must deal uncompromisingly. We must deal decisively with our own sin. Because you know what? So often sin gets passed on from generation to generation. It just seems to seep its way through. The younger generation picks up the hints or sometimes the more obvious details, and they end up behaving the same way themselves. You see, from Jacob through to Joseph, there was a trail of sin that had not been dealt with, and it took its toll. And yet, we have to ask the question, how does this relate to the sovereign rule of God? The sovereign rule of God that we've just spoken of? Well, Galatians 6 and verse 7 says a man reaps what he sows. So God in his sovereign rule is allowing these people to reap what they sow because of their sin that had not been repented of and dealt with. Let's make sure, for the sake of our children, and they might be our actual children in our families, or they might be children as in people younger in the faith, as others in the church that may see something of an example in us. For the sake of them, let's deal with sin. And then finally, let's look at another Joseph. You see, just in this chapter, we are introduced to a son who is greatly loved by his father, who is obedient to his father's will, who is hated and rejected by his own people, who is sold for silver, and who dies, or certainly as far as his father is concerned. And then to pull in points later from the story in the chapters, and I hope I'm not doing too much of a spoiler because you're probably familiar with these chapters anyway, this same son, Joseph, is falsely accused. He's unjustly punished. He is then raised, as it were, from death, raised from prison to save his people from death. Now we've got to look at that and say, hang on, that's a whole string of coincidences, isn't it? Or is it more than that? I think we've got to look beyond Joseph to another Joseph. God is pointing us to Jesus. And we should again here stand in awe of the invisible hand who 1900 years before Jesus arranged all of these circumstances to prepare people, to give them ideas of how God could work in such unlikely ways to save and to rescue his people. They would see the pattern. They would see that how God worked through Joseph was similar to how he worked then with the Messiah, with Jesus, God's one and only beloved Son. And so Joseph points us to another Joseph, that God would send his beloved Son, who would be obedient to the plan of his father, who would be hated and rejected, sold for 30 pieces of silver rather than 20 that Joseph was sold for. That's inflation for you over 1900 years. He was falsely accused, unjustly punished, but was raised from the dead in order to save us from eternal death and damnation. One big difference is that Joseph was only reported to have died whereas Jesus genuinely died. Isn't it amazing what Joseph went through beyond his own control? And isn't it even more amazing that what Jesus went through, that was within his control? Joseph was just a victim. Jesus was happily, though it was very hard, happily coming into the world to do the will of his Father, to rescue us from sin. How glorious is that? The invisible hand of God.